America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Last week we had breaking news as a barrage of missiles had been fired on Syrian targets on Friday night. This week we had a midweek blockbuster. CIA Director and Secretary of State designate Mike Pompeo went to North Korea over Easter and met with Kim Jong-un. There are other stories this week, including President Trump's meeting with Japan's Prime Minister Abe and the president's spirited defense of how tough he is on Russia. To talk about all these stories of the week, I've got four of the Beltway's best. James Hohmann of The Washington Post, Anna Palmer of Politico, Hope Speck of Military.com, and Al Weaver of The Washington Examiner. Welcome to you all. Where you sit determines what you see and what you think is the most important story of the week. So let me start with you, James Hohmann. What do you think? I think it's Pompeo and his nomination and his going to North Korea. What say you?
I agree, Hugh. North Korea was the biggest story of the week. It's the most consequential. North Korea has nuclear weapons. They pose the biggest, most direct threat to our national security. And this has been, so far, one of Trump's greatest successes. He has brought the North Koreans to the table through maximum pressure. And the most recent news going into the weekend is that North Korea is now saying in negotiations removing U.S. troops from South Korea is off the table. They're no longer demanding that as a condition for denuclearization. That's a huge breakthrough. I think that the summit is going to happen. I think Trump's going to drive a hard bargain, but there's a possibility of a huge breakthrough deal.
Now, James Hohmann, your colleague Philip Rucker was on the radio with me this week and said that the North Korea breakthrough potential has really upped the stakes on the Mike Pompeo nomination, putting Democrats deep into a corner that if they vote against or delay the Pompeo nomination, they may be playing with the one opening we have with North Korea. Do you agree or disagree with Rucker?
Well, yeah, I think Pompeo is going to end up getting confirmed because Heidi Heitkamp, the Democrat Dakota, got on board with his confirmation, so it's going to be close. I think that there's some sense that this is an issue where if you oppose Pompeo, you open yourself up to attacks in some of these red states is not supporting the president on foreign policy during this kind of key moment. A lot of Democrats kind of were forced on Thursday to grudgingly acknowledge sort of admiration or respect for Pompeo going to meet with Kim Jong-un over Easter, but it didn't move a lot of their votes. So even as you saw a bunch of the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee say that was a good step, they still kind of had to reiterate their opposition.
Anna Palmer from Politico, what do you think is the story of the week?
I think one of the most interesting stories was UN Ambassador Nikki Haley asserting herself and saying, no, I wasn't confused, that I actually believe the policy was going to strengthen U.S. sanctions against Russia. I think from my perspective, it really matters in terms of her solidifying her position and saying, I'm not going to be, beat around by this White House as many of the other principals and other cabinet secretaries have been.
Nikki Haley had quite the week running up to Syria and the week thereafter. This controversy aside, she really did determine, I think, a public profile that is exceptional in American politics today. You agree with that, Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. I think she has continued to elevate herself as a serious player, an ability to be close to the Trump White House, but also on the world stage be a real effective voice for this country. And I think, you already started to hear this talk of, a potential 2020 run and other things. So there's clearly a sense among the political operatives that this position will not be her last in government.
Hope Speck from Military.com. What did you think the story of the week was as we follow up the aftermath of last week's breaking news?
Well, the aftermath of the strike on Syria, I think, has dominated in a lot of ways. What that strike in response to chemical attacks on the Syrian people, what it offered the president was sort of an unequivocal military victory. They struck twice as hard as they did last year in response to a similar attack. They have the support of some coalition partners, and they cripple 3 chemical weapons facilities. And you saw President Trump tweet, mission accomplished. Now, as the week has worn on, we've seen sort of the aftermath and the fact that it's not quite so simple. The regime continues. It doesn't address kind of conventional attacks. Chemical weapons capabilities persist, the Pentagon has said. And then you've got ISIS, and in Syria, it looked like a victory kind of was on the cusp of taking place, and now we're seeing a resurgence. So you've got kind of what.
Let me ask you a question. Did we get any knowledge of whether or not the S-400 was used, whether or not the Russian system that is so vaunted actually engaged any of our missiles? What's your reporting on that?
So Russia is sort of using this as a marketing opportunity for the S-400, sort of F-35 killer missile. The Pentagon, though, has been unequivocal. Russian defenses were not employed, and Syrian defenses were ineffective. Every single one of the 1 of 5 weapons reached their target.
Al Weaver, you bat and clean up. What do you think is the story of the week?
I agree with James. North Korea is obviously the biggest story of the week. I'm going to take a different tack, though, obviously. We touched on Heidi Heitkamp earlier. I think it's an example of the White House and Congress really trying to put, and Republicans really trying to put some of these Democratic incumbents on defense here. You have Heidi Heitkamp coming out and supporting Pompeo's nomination. There's a few other Democrats that have not come out yet and supported her, and mostly Joe Donnelly, Joe Manchin, a few others. The White House and Republicans are really trying to tighten the screws on these folks and really put them on defense ahead of 20. I think that's a big story. But Pompeo really going North Korea, I think that's really going to elevate him. This vote next week is coming up in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We're going to wait to see what happens on that. If they actually end up going straight from that to a floor vote without him passing through committee, that's going to be a big question. But I think it's the tightening the screws on these 2018 candidates as far as North Korea. You haven't seen foreign policy become a big campaign issue this year. And I think you're starting to see it a little bit.
You know, Al, I can't imagine a Democrat up for re-election wanting to spike the North Korean opportunity. That's why I think there'll be a lot more votes than Heidi Heitkamp. But let me ask you about Rand Paul. The president said Rand's always been with me before. Rand Paul voted for John Kerry in the Foreign Relations Committee. Does Rand Paul at least pass the nomination out of committee to get it to the floor without any kind of the filibuster nonsense that Chuck Schumer's been muttering about? Does Rand move, in other words?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that he does. I'm very skeptical to think that he will. You've seen him recently move a little bit. He didn't hold up the omnibus negotiations, or at least the final passage of the bill a couple weeks ago. That was a bit of a shift in tack for him. But usually he's someone who just doesn't end up caring about these type of things, and he'll do what he wants. I'd be very surprised if he ends up voting for Pompeo to move him to the floor. But, you know, he has a weird relationship with the president. It wouldn't totally surprise me, but it would surprise me.
Watch that space. Now, let me play a clip, if I can, of the president talking about Russia when he was with Prime Minister Abiy. This is what he had to say about his relationship with Russia.
As far as the investigation, nobody has ever been more transparent than I have instructed our lawyers. Be totally transparent. As far as the two gentlemen you told me about, they've been saying I'm going to get rid of them for the last 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And they're still here.
James Hohmann, they're still here. He's talking about Mr. Mueller and Mr. Rosenstein in the Russia investigation. Do they go anywhere this week? What's your reporting on that?
Well, I think Trump has sort of backed off a little bit from last week. He's more concerned about the Michael Cohen raid of his lawyer's office than he is about what Mueller's doing right now. Hiring Rudy Giuliani as part of his legal defense team. Giuliani saying, I think we can wrap this up in a matter of weeks. Giuliani touting his long relationship with Mueller and the president, and saying kind of he can be a broker in some ways. People are still on edge in Washington that Trump could move against Rosenstein. Likely he wouldn't go, try to go directly right away against Mueller. You could also see a scenario where Jeff Sessions, somehow left. If Sessions leaves, then whoever replaces him, potentially through the Vacancies Act, would end up overseeing the investigation if that person's not conflicted out. So I think Trump has backed off somewhat. There was some reporting that Rosenstein assured Trump during a meeting last week that he's not a target of Mueller's investigation, and that assuaged some of the president's concerns. Nationally, I think a lot of liberals are still very on edge. There was a report this week from Pittsburgh that the Pittsburgh Police Department is preparing for potential riots in the streets if Trump fires Mueller.
Great. Al Weaver, very quick, what to you? Do you hear about any changes at the Department of Justice? The president just seemed to indicate no, that's not going to happen. What do you hear?
I'm not hearing anything on that end. There are still some nervous senators up on Capitol Hill. Tom Tillis, Lindsey Graham, a couple of Democrats have the legislation out that will come up before the Judiciary Committee, to help protect Mueller. I don't see that going anywhere. Mitch McConnell threw cold water on that this week. So right now it's kind of remains in the status quo.
All right, I'll be right back with